Okay, welcome everybody. It's now our third lecture in cognitive psychology, and today we will speak about attention. Okay, our schedule for today, after some brief introduction into the topic of attention, we will speak about theoretical models of attention, and that will take quite a while. Then a bit about automaticity, and then when we have time in the end, we will hopefully get to a rather practical demonstration of how the Stroop interference works and how it feels to do that task. Okay, let's start with an introduction into the topic of attention. And as usual, we would like to start with a definition. However, if you think for yourself what attention is, you can think about that for a moment. How would you define that? Then you may come to the point, or same conclusion as William James came in 1890, that he said, well, everybody knows what attention is. And that's a rather famous quote of him. And luckily he didn't stop here, but then actually provided a definition of attention. And it's quite impressive that even in 1890 he formulated a definition which is still today quite popular and not so far from other more recent definitions from attention. Okay, so what did he say? It's a little bit longer phrase. He said, everybody knows what attention is. It is the taking possession of the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seem several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. So I'd like to point out some key things he said. So it's like one out of several. So attention has something to do with focalization and concentration, when we have loads of things that we focalize on one thing. And at the same time, when we focus on one thing, we automatically withdraw our attention from other things. So it's usually not possible to have full focused attention on the whole perceptual scene we see, for instance. You will see that these are the key aspects of modern definition of attention as well. So one of such newer definitions is that attention is the cognitive process of selectively concentrating on one aspect of the external or internal environment while ignoring other aspects. So again, it's this idea of we focus on one specific thing at the cost of ignoring other things. That's the idea of attention. The experimental research on attention actually started only in the 1950s, again with the cognitive revolution, so to say. Before that, there was not much research. And as you may have seen already from my examples, attention has quite a central role in perception of our outside world. And the reason is that usually our perception is that when we look around, we perceive everything in a very high level of richness. So when I look here into the auditorium, I see a lot of people and all different types of people. When you look in the front, you see the screen, you see me, the computer, the background, all that different stuff. You know the people next to you and so. But actually, although we have this perception of, wow, we have this rich scene, we actually notice the details of objects only when we really actually pay attention to them. And to demonstrate that to you, I would like to ask you to close your eyes for a moment. I won't do nasty things here with you, so throwing water balloons or something like that. Just close your eyes for a moment. Okay, so try to remember, what is the color of the jumper or shirt of the person sitting next to you? What's the color of my shirt? What's the color of the curtain in the background here in the front? If you have noticed at all that there is a curtain. Okay, you can open your eyes now again. So most people find that suddenly they realize, well, actually I didn't notice. Before that you thought you saw everything. Of course you saw the person next to you, you saw me, you saw the background, everything. But you actually really notice. It becomes the focus of your attention only when you focus on it. And then you actually, the things come to awareness and we process details. So we need attention to perceive things actually consciously. There are a number of demonstrations and we will go through them and hopefully that can wake you up a little bit on this early morning hour. So one very famous demonstration, you may have seen examples of this, is change blindness. And I will play a couple of video clips now. And okay, you may know the first one because it's in the textbook. So let's take a different one. So you will see two pictures alternating between each other. And there's quite a big difference between the pictures. And for quite a few people, they don't see that immediately. It takes them quite a while. Do you see what's different between the two pictures? Who sees it? Raise your hands. Okay, most of you see that. Yeah, it's the thing in the background. From the occasional, in the background, I gather not everybody saw it immediately. Okay, let's have a different example. And I mean, for those of you who didn't realize that immediately, that's quite a big change here. Once you see it, it's evident. If you didn't see it immediately, okay, let's have a different. That of course doesn't work. Raise your hands as soon as you see the difference. Okay, it's not that many anymore. It's a bit more difficult, this one. Focus on the center area here. It's the background which changes between bright and dark. Once you saw it, you say, how could I miss that? And let's have a last demonstration. Okay. Oh no, I want to show you that one because I think I've never seen it myself actually. Maybe you can tell me. Yeah, that one. I found it once, but I forgot again what the difference is. Okay, can anybody tell me? I don't know. Sorry? Sorry? Here. Yeah. Okay. No, I saw. Yeah, I saw it before. I forgot it again, and then you miss it again. It's really strange. So, how can that be? That there are so blatant changes, and it takes us like half a minute to detect that. You know these pictures in newspapers where you sometimes find the differences. If there would be such a difference, we would think it's for 3 years old children, but not for adults. Okay. So, I skipped that one. There's an airplane, the jet engine missing. That's an example from the book. That's why I skipped that. In the dinner, if you see that directly next to each other, you say, well, what's the big deal in finding the difference? That's a bit more difficult, but still doesn't take too much time if you see it directly next to each other. And this is sometimes called the flicker paradigm as well. And it was first kind of discovered by Rensing and colleagues in 1997. And one of the two papers I recommended as additional reading is the original paper on that phenomenon. And the reason why it is difficult for us to perceive that is only that we don't see the two images in direct succession, but there's a brief blank interval between them. And it's that brief interval which makes it so difficult for us to detect the change. And so that it takes quite a while to find that. So the reason or the explanation for that is that we usually process input on the one hand from bottom up. So from low features to higher features and more abstract forms. And this processing is optimized towards continuous input. Because usually our scenes and our surroundings don't change immediately, suddenly. There's not a person disappearing from one moment to the other. And if we have changes in reality, they are usually due to motion. So motion is a very salient, very captive feature. When there's something moves in our surrounding, we usually immediately our attention gets drawn to that aspect. And that's natural, because moving objects may be dangerous to us, thinking from an evolutionary perspective. However, this brief blank screen disrupts this idea of continuous bottom-up processing. So we actually don't detect this change, this motion, so to say, this movement in our surrounding. That doesn't work anymore. And so our system is totally lost. And what we then need is actually deliberate attention. We have to use conscious attention to really search the two images from point to point. So it's a top-down process now, because our bottom-up doesn't work anymore. So what you have, when you searched for the difference, what you have experienced is your explicit use of attention to find something. Okay, there's a quite funny demonstration that this actually even works outside the laboratory. And you can swap conversation partners without people noticing. And let's have a demonstration of that. So this is now a movie clip. I hope that I hope the sound works. I have no idea.
Watch what happens if the unsuspecting pedestrian provides directions.
So the situation is that this is a person on campus, just a random person, and this person asks for direction.
The young man on the left is one of the experimenters. He has approached the white-haired man and asked for directions. Watch closely as two people carrying a door pass between them, and the first experimenter is replaced by someone else. Like many of the people in the study, the pedestrian is entirely unaware that he was talking to a different person. Approximately 50% of the people approached in this study didn't notice when the person they were talking to was replaced by someone else. This study was among the first to demonstrate that change blindness can occur outside of the laboratory.
Okay, so it actually shows how strong this effect is. Of course, you shouldn't expect that when you talk to your friend. Hopefully you will notice that. If it's a person you know well, then it's very likely that it doesn't work, that you can just swap conversation partner. But it shows how we need actually attention to notice details. If we really don't pay attention to a person in front of us, they could be swapped and we wouldn't notice. Okay, and the final demonstration. Some of you, or many of you, may know that general paradigm or thing, but I would still like to ask you to do that, because there may be a different version which you don't know. And in particular, don't speak to your neighbor and tell them, and try to be quiet. So what you will see is like on a stage, two teams of players, and they play basketball to each other. There are players with white shirts and black shirts, and your task is to count how many times the player in white shirts pass the ball among each other. Okay, the players move all the time, so it's quite a difficult task to count that. Okay.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
Try really to do it.
Answer is 16 passes. If you spot the gorilla, for people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half is the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color for the player on the black team leading the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
So curtain changes, and one player went out.
When looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion.
Okay, may I quickly ask, who knew the gorilla video, the original one? Okay, who knew that version with the curtain and... Okay, so not that many people anymore, because I don't want to bore you with stuff like that. So this is an example of inattentional blindness. So that we actually miss things when we don't pay attention. And an interesting fact of the original study was that he said around 50% of the people miss the gorilla. And quite a big proportion of the people who missed the gorilla actually looked at that. So you can record the eye movements and record exactly where people look on the screen. So the average fixation time on the gorilla was 1 second for these people. So you look for 1 second at a gorilla in such a setting and you still do not notice it. So that shows that attention really heavily influences our perception. From everything we would say, from bottom-up processing, we would say, of course this person saw the gorilla. He must have perceived it. No, they did not, because they did not pay attention to that. So always keep that in mind. In whatever setting you may be or work in the future, that attention is extremely powerful and you need to keep that in mind. If you try to design human-computer interaction or machine interfaces or work in a teaching setting or whatever, if the attention is not at the right place, you may run into serious difficulties. Some other examples of inattentional blindness are in movies where quite often, I hope you can see that, it's that here the background changes from one scene to the next. People usually don't notice. There are a lot of these mistakes We had that in the introduction, the example from Harry Potter. From one scene to the next, he just sits on the different side of the table. Nobody notices. In the movie Speed, the bus sometimes has no advertisement, sometimes really big things hanging around here. Most people don't notice. Sorry?
Use the bus, but it's the opposite side. You look at it.
No, I don't think so. I think it both times drives into that direction. Yeah. Okay, we have that example. 2 jet engines, one from one cut to the next. And like here, the position of the headrest, one's up, one's down. And most people just don't notice because our attention probably is on the actor, on the protagonist. So that we just don't care, and we completely fade that information out. Of course, that has implications for everyday life. When we think about eyewitness testimony, we really may be concerned about what witnesses really have paid attention to, what they may have missed. For instance, if they have 2 or 3 people involved in a crime, did they maybe missed that 2 of the people changed identity, not changed identity, but they mixed them up or something like that. When you drive a car in traffic, you are heavily dependent on noticing changes, other cars appearing and so forth. And here, for instance, it's of relevance that elderly people are slower in detection of such changes, which increases some risk of making an accident. And in human-machine interaction, of course, we may miss important signals if they're not salient enough, like radar operators, or that people don't pay attention if we put it into a location which is too far of our usual focus of attention. Okay, to summarize this introduction, we have seen that a good definition of attention is that it allows us to focus on a particular stimulus while at the same time we disregard other stimuli. So it's focus and disregarding. We have seen that attention really quite strongly affects our perception. We have seen the change blindness paradigm, this flicker paradigm, inattentional blindness, the gorilla thing, and the examples from the movies. And to go a little bit beyond that, attention really affects a lot of other processes. So for instance, learning. How much attention do you pay to the material you are trying to memorize? Working memory, vigilance, how awake you are, and things like that. So attention can be said to be a very, very central topic in psychology. Okay, any questions on this introduction? Okay, so let's get to models of attention. So attention allows us to focus on particular stimulus while disregarding other stimuli. So this results in some key research questions we may ask. One is, how do we choose which stimuli we attend to and which we ignore? Who does this decision? Or is it bottom-up? Is it top-down? And at which level is information processed when we decide to pay attention to a stimulus? And how far are the stimuli processed which we do not attend to? So it could be physical characteristics, like just the loudness or brightness of a stimulus, or it could be the meaning of the message of conversation or something. And yes, what I said, what happens to the stimuli which are not attended? So we will discuss now 4 different models of attention and how they answer these questions. And research of attention, you might say, started a little bit with research into something which is called the cocktail party phenomenon. And that is basically that when you are at a party where there are a lot of people and it may be really crowded, like this is a big scientific conference where at each store here people present their posters and have discussions, where most people don't have much trouble focusing on one person and get into a conversation with that person, and completely ignoring all other conversations around them. So you can do that usually. In addition, you may be able to switch the focus of your attention. So you talk to one person, and then you decide, okay, now I want to get into the conversation with this person. So you suddenly are able to listen to that person and ignore the other person completely. And this observation has kind of initiated some research, or a line of research in attention. And a British engineer named Cherry wanted to investigate that scientifically. And he used what is called a dichotic listening paradigm. And here, a different message is played to each ear. So you have headphones on. Is a picture here? Yeah. So you have headphones on, one side, one message, other side, other message. And when the voices had the same physical properties, so in the most confusing case, the same speaker, people find it very difficult actually to keep the two messages apart and to separate that. So just using meaning only is quite difficult, even if they talk about their last holiday vacation and they talk about some engineering lecture they listen to. So it's very difficult to keep that apart. Now, he asked, okay, how much information is retained when we ask the person to focus only on one message and just ignore the other one? So we have an unattended message. And of course, you want to control what the person is actually doing. If you just tell them, attend to the right, you don't know whether they may actually switch in between to the left ear and pick up attended information from there. And to bind the attention to one message, people use a shadowing task. And that's basically like a dichotic listening task. A different message is played to each ear. However, you are asked to overtly repeat the message played to one ear. So let's say for this person, the left ear is asked to attend to, and on the headphone it says President Lincoln, often read by the light of the fire. Then online, for the whole time, this person is asked to shadow that and say President Lincoln, often read by the light of the fire. So it's quite a demanding task, because you are speaking and at the same time you are listening. It's like a little bit like these people who simultaneously or online do translations without translating something. And then you have the ignored input. So some other message here on that ear. And because this task is so demanding, people assume that people really paid attention only to the here. If they switch attention to here, usually you realize that by stuttering speech output, because they lose focus here on that task. So you have a good measure of that really attention is paid only to one side. So the question now is anything remembered from this side? Do we pick up anything here? That's the idea of we focus on one thing and ignore other things. What happens to the ignored stimulus? So mostly only really low-level physical properties were noticed. So like the loudness of a stimulus or something. However, people did manipulations to this unattended message, and people did not notice anything from the meaning of the message. They didn't recall what the story was about, for instance. They didn't notice when the language changed, for instance, from English to German. They did not notice when there was a change in gender, when the male speaker changed to a female speaker, when the message suddenly was in reverse speech. Things like that. So the unattended message really seems to be filtered out very early in processing. There seems to be no higher level processing of that message. And that explains as well why, for instance, when you close your eyes, you suddenly can't remember the color of the sweater of the person next to you. It's really filtered out very early. So it doesn't reach memory or higher processing for meaning or something. And based on this research, and of course his own research, the British psychologist Donald Broadbent proposed the first model of attention, and it also was the first model of this information processing approach. So what his idea was that we get inputs from the outside world. And we have an attended message and we have an unattended message. And this is an example from dichotic listening, one ear attended, the other unattended. But you can transfer that in the same way to attending to one conversation partner and ignoring the other one. And all information first enters a sensory buffer store. All information. There's no filtering at that stage. That information from the buffer store then goes to a selective filter. And this filter filters out stimuli so that for higher level processing, only one message or one stimulus or one thing we focus on is passed on. So this filter is an all or nothing filter. What we attend to, what we focus on, goes through the filter and is processed and becomes aware to us. And what we don't attend to, like this message, is completely blocked out. And he proposed that this filter works on very low-level characteristics, like pitch of something, the loudness of something, or on these levels, not on levels of meaning or so. It's really physical characteristics. Of course, we also have other inputs, not only auditory from the ears, but we have visual input from the eyes. So we have different channels where we receive input. And all this information goes into the sensory buffer store and then passes through the filter. Okay, which channel do we attend to? So either audition or vision, for instance. And that can be guided by attention. So in a voluntary way, goal-directed, top-down. So when I try to really hear something, some very faint noise, you can direct your attention there, or in the other way around, when you try to see something, you may direct your attention there. However, it may also be guided by reflexive attention. That means when you have a very salient stimulus, it automatically draws your attention. And I remember, I don't do that usually because I'm not that type of person. When I was a student and we came to that part, the lecturer started before that, speaking slightly monotonously, and did like that, and then suddenly he made a very loud noise, and half of the auditorium was awake again. So when you have a loud, sudden noise, then of course that can capture your attention, even if you have visual attention focused on the slide here or something. So I used the term salience now 1 or 2 times, so I don't know how familiar you are with that, so I will very briefly explain that. So, because it's a concept which is in perception and attention quite an important concept. And salience, or sometimes called saliency as well, is basically the quality by how an item, like a stimulus or a person, stands out relative to its neighbors. So it's the contrast of something to the neighborhood. And there's no absolute definition except for this contrast thing. So to give you an example, here the salient stimulus clearly is the red A. It stands out among all the black A's. So that is a salient stimulus. In this example, it's the black A which is salient. So you see, it's just the contrast. It's not that red is always salient, it's just how it compares to its surroundings. And such salient stimuli always kind of drag our attention towards them. Okay. So coming back to the filter model, which channel is attended to? We have channel, audition, vision, that can be guided either top-down or bottom-up. So then now within that channel, which information do we attend to? So suppose we focus on the auditory channel and we are at a party, to which conversation do we attend to? So, or where in our visual scene do we look to? And that is guided by bottom-up basic physical features like pitch, loudness, or in this visual scene, color, direction, and things like that. These are the characteristics by which we can feature that out. Of course, that can be influenced by top-down processes as well, because we can easily switch conversation partner by that. Okay. So the stimuli, which then pass the filter, become the focus of attention. That's where we attend to. And as I said, the unattended stimuli are completely disregarded. It's an all or nothing filter. Okay. That's the Broadbent filter model. Now, let's suppose again, go back to a cocktail party. Let's say we have two persons here. We have Edward and we have Betty, and they are in conversation with each other. And they are really focused and involved and everything. And now we have John here, and John has another conversation. And according to Broadbent's model, that should be really ignored and filtered out. So suppose John says something like, "Last week I went golfing with Edward," and then goes on. And you may notice that or know that from your own experience, that in these circumstances, it is not unlikely that Edward, although deeply in conversation here, suddenly notices his name and says, "Oh, somebody said my name, what's going on here?" So that finding cannot be explained by the Broadbent model, because that all should be filtered out so early that it's not processed for meaning. So there should be no processing of that information to decipher the name. Based on this finding, Treisman, which is quite a big researcher in visual attention and visual search, proposed a further model which built upon the Broadbent model, which is called the attenuator model. And I have a picture here of Treisman, and that's her husband, which is Daniel Kahneman. You may have heard the name before. He is, to my knowledge, the only psychologist who ever won a Nobel Prize. And that was based on his research in decision making, which gave him a Nobel Prize in economics. So her model is based on Broadbent's filter model. And while a lot of assumptions and ideas are the same, she thought of a different mechanism of how the filtering works. And she said it's not an all or nothing filter like Broadbent proposed, but instead it's a gradual working attenuator. That's the key idea. Okay, let's have a look at that. So going back, that's Broadbent's filter model. And by the way, because the information is filtered out so early, it's called an early selection model. Now, Treisman's model is also an early selection model, and if you compare them, they don't look too dissimilar from each other. So in Treisman's model, again, we have input, an attended and an unattended message, which go into a buffer store, then they are passed on to a filter here. And in Treisman, this filter again works on physical properties. So it filters out unattended input by, okay, that's the wrong pitch I don't want to attend to, the wrong loudness, or whatever. However, what she said is that this filter doesn't work on an all or nothing way, but it passes on the unattended message in an attenuated way. So it's brought down. It's then passed here to this higher level processing, where she said, okay, there's a hierarchy by which the message is analyzed. So it can be first starting on syllables, then it's more complex for words, then grammar, and finally semantics, which basically means meaning. So the idea is that here the attenuated message is passed on always. And it is further processed for meaning, or higher processed, when it exceeds a certain threshold. So how is this threshold determined? It's affected by context and priming, and, for instance, by subjective importance. So we have the unattended message maybe processed only on a very low level, but because our name has such an is so important for us, it has a higher salience, and suddenly the unattended message gets a higher processing as well, and it's processed for meaning. Okay. So, as I said, it is an early selection model, and it captures this finding that information which is initially unintended actually may become the attended message, the message we focus on, so we are aware of that. And if you think of the situation, what happens is that attention really fully switches. If you hear your name, your attention is then fully focused on the other conversation, and you lose track of the conversation you're actually doing. That's usually what then results in the trouble with your conversation partner when they say, you actually don't listen to me, or something. All other information is decaying in sensory memory. So Treisman's model, in the same way as Broadbent's model, says that information which we do not attend to can have no effect on our behavior, because only when we attend to it, then we process it for meaning. So behavior is only affected by information we become aware of. That means by attended information. And that's a quite strong prediction of the model, which poses a problem, as we will see in a moment. Now we've seen these two models are early selection models. An alternative to that has been proposed, which are called late selection models. So, as the name suggests, the selection is late. That means late in the processing stream. That means all information is fully analyzed for meaning. So when you are at a party and there are 10 conversations in your reach, your brain processes all 10 conversations for its full meaning. And only then, based on physical properties and meaning, selection at a filter takes place. So in this case, we can also use meaning to guide our attention, the meaning which is in a message for that. So to evaluate this idea, on the one hand, it's very appealing because all information is processed, so we are not prone of missing anything important. That would be quite an advantage. However, could you think of any disadvantage of that mental approach? It's actually very resource demanding. Suppose you have to track everything and fully process everything for meaning. That is quite a heavy load, which we would suffer from. Okay, so to compare these models schematically, Broadbent's early selection filter model says we have input here on different streams, and then we have an all or nothing filter, which then it's called here memory level, and that means higher level processing generally. Then we have the attenuator model, where we say, okay, all information is going through a filter, but it's attenuated to a certain degree. And then we have the late selection model, where all information is processed into memory level and then processed for deeper meaning. How could we test whether late selection models are true or not? And now we are going back to this key assumption: all information is fully processed. If you remember, for the early selection model, we said only attended information is fully processed. This assumption states also the information which is not attended to and which is unaware. So, If late selection models are right, unaware information should have the power to influence our behavior. Okay. So, how can we test that? And we go back a little bit here to more anecdotal evidence. There's a person called James Vicary, and though you may not know the name, you probably have heard what he has done, and that is in the 50s in movie theaters in the US. During the presentation of the movie, he flickered messages like drink Coca-Cola, eat popcorn. And he presented these messages only for 0.3 milliseconds. So it was so briefly that actually there was no way of becoming aware of that. People just didn't see that. Now, he claimed that sales of Coca-Cola and popcorn increased quite dramatically, like 20 to 60%. However, as it later turned out, most likely these results are faked. And to get the background behind that, he had kind of a company or something like that. So he was quite interested in that this actually worked for his own benefit. So, but nevertheless, although it's from a scientific point of view a myth and not true what he found, it started the discussion about subliminal persuasion. Subliminal meaning it's below our threshold of detection, it's unaware. And the idea of that we can influence behavior of people without them noticing, which is of course of interest to many, many people, for good or bad. So, how can we test it in a more scientific approach? And here we have a look at the study by Stanislas Dehaene from 1998. And he used the paradigm which is called subliminal priming. And let's go through the task participants had to do. So again, it's just a computer task. Participants sit in front of the computer, hands rest on keys, and the task is just to decide when they see a target letter, target number, is it larger than 5, press right hand, smaller than 5, press left hand. Well, that's a pretty easy task. Now what he did was that sometime before the target, he also presented a number, the so-called prime. And the prime could, like in this example, prime the same hand. So it's a congruent trial. Prime and target require the same response. Of course, the prime shouldn't be responded to. And because we speak of subliminal priming, what he did was that he used two masks of letters which represented before and after the prime, which make the prime invisible. You see something flickering on the screen, but you can't tell what you saw. So this prime, is subliminal. It's unaware to people. So if it has an effect, what would you think happens in such a congruent trial? People are faster because the right response has been primed. In the incongruent trial, where it's in this example the prime asks for the other hand, the wrong hand, you become slower. If we do not process information which is subliminal, the prime shouldn't make an effect at all. So early selection models would say prime doesn't have an effect, same response times for congruent and incongruent. Late selection models predict congruent faster than incongruent. And these are the data you found. These are the response times. And these are the different notations I will explain in a moment. These are the congruent trials. These are the congruent, these are the incongruent. So you see, there is a priming effect. The information must have been processed. And he varied the notation. So you see here, the number is as a word, and here is as an Arabic number. And he had so this is word verbal, and alphanumeric number verbal, and so forth. These are the different notations. So people really read that and process that into a meaning of, okay, it's a 9, it's larger than 5, I have to press the right hand. So it's really very, very high level processing. Okay. So this subliminal priming works well. And I would like to point out something. In the Gobet textbook, it says that the typical response time differences between congruent and incongruent primes are often 5 to 10 milliseconds only. I worked in that area a little bit. I would say they are larger. They can be up to 80 or 100 milliseconds. And here you see it's around 30 milliseconds here. But depending on the paradigm, you can really make quite strong effects here. And there are many, many variations which have confirmed subliminal primes work. You can influence the trajectory of eye movements, you can influence response times and load of different types of visual stimuli and things like that. The Coca-Cola ads of James Vicary did not work. And all ways to replicate this thing failed also. So of course they have to try to replicate that, like increasing the sales of stuff when you subliminally present something. And it always didn't work. So what's the difference between that? There are two very, very important differences. So one is that in the subliminal priming paradigm, like in the Dehane one, what you do is you sit in front of the computer. You are asked to respond as quickly as possible to a number. So your whole mindset is see a number and respond. And then there's a number subliminally presented. Then you respond to that. Your system picks that up. So you are in an extreme, narrow and highly specified action program. You have a goal. Identify the number and respond as quickly as possible. The second one is that your response occurs very quickly after the prime. It's a couple of 100 milliseconds. In the Coca-Cola example, you have minutes between the flashing and you actually go out and buy, at least minutes. And as well, you sit there, you want to watch a movie, you're not in the mind setting of, okay, should I drink Coca-Cola or Pepsi? Maybe then when you flash Coca-Cola all the time, you may slightly bias that if they really have that in front of them. Although I've seen people trying that with sample sizes of more than 100 people, they were not able to show that even then that you can influence people's behavior. So if the prime, in other words, is not relevant to your current behavioral goal, it is ineffective. So in Dehane's paradigm, probably even if you just present left for left hand instead of a number, it wouldn't work. Maybe there's a teensy tiny effect here, I don't know. But in particular, if you present a drink Coke here, and then maybe after the experiment offer the choice between Coke and Pepsi or some chocolate bar, it won't work. Because it's information you're not programmed to process right now. So, because that is something psychologists are often asked for from non-psychologists. Oh, does that really work, subliminal persuasion? It works in these experimental settings if you really are in these tight constraints. It does not that easily work in these settings which are more interesting for the larger community. Okay, so we are now at a situation which is a little bit difficult for us. We have evidence for early selection models because we have seen that unattended information is not retained, or in the shadowing task you even don't notice that the speaker changes or something like that. But also we have evidence here for late selection models. So subliminal stimuli are actually processed for their meaning. That's strong evidence in favor of that. So what model is correct? And in psychology, you often have competing models who try to describe something, explain something. And one way out is that after some time, it turns out one model is wrong, one is correct. However, more often, and in particular in these circumstances, what you find is that maybe both are right. And maybe both of them just don't describe the whole story. Maybe it's that some selection is only sometimes early and only sometimes late. And depending on the context, depending on the paradigm you use, it's sometimes early, sometimes late. If that is the case, then of course we have to ask the question, what determines when selection is early or late? Here, Lavie from the UCL in London has proposed that it's the amount of mental load we have, which is the defining characteristic whether it is early or late selection. And she proposed a theory of perceptual load, or in brief, load theory. And the basic idea is that when tasks are very difficult, then we need to focus our resources. So, for instance, we want to find a specific DVD among a lot of other DVDs. That's a difficult task. We have to focus our attention and really go look at DVD after DVD. Like in the flickering paradigm, you really have to use your focused attention and search all visual elements to see the difference between the two pictures. Because we require a lot of attentional resources for that task, selection is early to make these resources available. So we just say, the idea behind that is a little bit that attention is a resource we have, and this resource is limited. So if we want to spend it on a couple of things, we have less for everything. If it's a difficult task, we collect all our resources and focus on one thing at the cost of completely ignoring everything else by having an early selection. If we have an easy task, on the other hand, for instance, finding a DVD among other books, this is a very salient stimulus which easily pops out, then this task requires only little attentional resources because it's so easy. So we can actually afford to do late selection because we have sufficient resources and process other stimuli for meaning. Of course, she has experimental evidence to support this load theory, that selection is sometimes early and sometimes late. And let's go through her task. Again, the basic task participants have to do is pretty easy. Again, a computerized task, and it's a two-choice response task. If you see an X, press the left key. If you see a Z, press the right key. That's all you have to do. So this is one screen, this is another screen. Here, press right finger, here, press left finger, as quickly as possible, as usual here. This is the low load condition. So that's an easy task. You only see one letter, you only have one stimulus here. Now what she also did, she presented so-called distractor letters. And these are letters, uppercase letters, these are lowercase, which are to be ignored by the participant. They are told, don't respond on them. And the distractor letter can either be incompatible, like here, so you have to respond to the Z with your right finger, but your distractor would indicate a left finger button press. Or it can be neutral, so some letter which is not Z or X. Okay, so in this case, the task is easy, so we have sufficient attentional resources, so we process the distractor. What would we expect? If we have something distracting us, it makes us slower. So the incompatible condition is slower than the neutral condition. These are response times, and this is neutral distractor and incompatible distractor. So we become slower. That's not a very surprising finding, and it has often been replicated. Now what happens when we make the task more difficult? The way she made it more difficult is that your target letter you have to respond to is now embedded in a stream of unrelated letters. So you have now always 6 letters and you have to search, oh, here's the Z, oh, here's the X. So it's a difficult task. You have to focus your attention and you have to scan all the items to find the one where you have to respond to. This is high load, it's difficult, so if the load theory is right, then people would focus so much on finding the target that they don't have any resources left to process the distractor. So what you would expect is that neutral and incompatible have the same response times. Of course, overall response times will be slower because the task is much more difficult. And that's exactly what she found. So on the difficult task, high perceptual load, the distractors don't have an effect. So the distractor is processed only in the easy task, but not in the difficult task. So in the hard task, we have early selection, and here we have late selection in the difficult task. So she nicely brings together these two ideas. Both ideas are correct, early selection and late selection. However, they are only used in some contexts. So to summarize our models of attention, the early selection model by Broadbent says or proposes that unattended information is filtered out completely early in processing. The attenuator model by Treisman says that unattended information is attenuated in early processing, not filtered out completely. The late selection models proposed that all information is processed for meaning and only filtered out very late in the processing. And then finally, the theory of perceptual load says that selection is early in difficult tasks and late in easy tasks. Okay, any questions on that one? Okay, then we have a break now, and then go on with automaticity. Okay, let's go on. Next we'll speak about automaticity, and afterwards as a little bit of a demonstration of automaticity, we will have a little demonstration, if time permits, of the Stroop task. That is the little sheets I've distributed around. I think some are missing in the front here, so if there are spare ones somewhere around, maybe you can pass them here to the front. Otherwise you may just share among you. It would be great if I could have them back in the end so that I can use them next year. Okay, so let's speak about automaticity. And the idea is of many people that our everyday processing behavior can be subdivided into two different categories. One is controlled processing, and that usually means with attention, with deliberate attention on that. So the features or characteristics of such controlled processing are that we have limited capacity for such processing. It requires attention. It's rather slow. It's effortful. We are aware of this processing. We are conscious of it. It's like in this, when you think about this visual search in the flicker paradigm, we are really limited here. It's effortful to search one item after the other. However, it is controllable. That means we can influence it. We can say, okay, now I searched everything on the boat, now I search everything here. And it's flexible. We can adjust it to varying or changing circumstances. On the other side, we have automatic processing. And here it's assumed that we have unlimited capacity. We don't require attention for that. It's rather fast. It's effortless. It's outside of our awareness. However, these are pretty good things when we don't have limited capacity on things. However, it's outside our awareness and it's uncontrollable. It runs automatically and it's inflexible. It can't be easily changed when circumstances change. Let's have some examples of that. Oh, okay. And theories differ in the way they think about this dichotomy. Some say really processing is either controlled or automatic. Others assume it's like a gradual transition between the two endpoints. Okay, so some examples. Controlled or automatic? Walking. What would you say? Who is in favor of it's controlled? Raise your hands. Who is in favor of it's automatic? Yeah, probably for us it's really automatic most of the time. However, if you think about little children when they learn to walk, or if you had an accident and you lost a leg and you have to relearn, then it can quickly become controlled again. So that you really need to pay full attention to that. Driving, what would you say? Automatic or controlled? Who is in favor of controlled? Who's in favor of automatic? Yeah. So for an experienced driver, it's most likely, or many things of driving are automatic. However, if you are an unexperienced or new driver, you may know it's highly controlled. So when you are a good driver or a long driver, then you can easily speak to your passenger. However, if you are in learning school and when you try to remember your first lesson, there's no way of speaking to anybody when you try to think of all the different things you have to take care of. Even turning the indicator to go left or right is a task which is highly controlled. So, and Schneider and Shiffrin were among the first to pick up the concept of automaticity and to investigate that. And they used the following task to get the first indication that there are two modes of processing, an automatic one and a controlled one. And suppose the following task. You have a memory set. You see in this example 4 letters, A, B, C, D, and you are asked to memorize them. Then there is a brief fixation period, a retention interval, and then you have a display set. And your task is any of these letters, has it appeared in the memory set? In this example, the answer is yes, because the B is from the memory set. Now what they did was they used 2 different conditions. One is that, which they called a consistent mapping, that the memory set always consisted of letters, and the display set, the distractors, the non-targets in the display set, always consisted of numbers. So, and they said detection of the target is automatic. Because in our culture, we have learned to really quickly keep letters and numbers apart. That happens automatically for us. If you think of Chinese people who never came across this alphabet, it's probably not automatic, or children. But we have learned it. And they had the varied mapping. And that task is much more difficult because here the memory set as well as the display set, consisted of letters and numbers. So in this example, you really had to serially go through that. Okay, the letter 1, was it in the memory set? No. The letter F, was it in the memory set? No. Letter B, oh yes, it was. So here they said it's controlled processing. We have to use attention, memory, everything to really go through that. Okay, so, sorry, going back one. They have different predictions. What happens when you increase the set size? Here it's an example of 4, but you could start only with 1 letter, increase to 2, and so forth. And the idea is when there's automatic detection, because it's fast, it's effortless, and it kind of automatically pops out, the response times to detect the target should be independent of the set size, because it immediately happens automatically. However, here in the controlled processing, where I have to go through one letter by the other, whether it was in the memory set, the response times should increase with increasing set size. And that's exactly what they found. In this varied mapping, the hard task where they proposed controlled processing, so these are different set sizes, we don't have to go into the details here, you see that response times increase with increasing set size. While in the easy task, where they proposed its automatic processing, we have a consistent map, we have a rather flat and very shallow increase only. So they say that is evidence that really when we have automatic processing, it's fast, effortless, independent of, in this example, set size, and the controlled processing can be differentiated from that. Now, of course, the question rises, how does an activity actually become automatic? And the key word here is practice. No matter what you want to have automatized, you need to practice that a lot. But still the mechanism is unclear. So how can it be? Schneider and Shiffrin proposed that controlled and automatic processing are basically based on the same cognitive processes. They just become more efficient, so that they are incredibly fast at some point. An alternative idea was proposed by Logan in 1988, and it's called the instance theory of automaticity. And he says that practice results in a shift of strategy how we do a task. So in other words, controlled and automatic processing are based on different cognitive processes. Schneider and Shiffrin would say it's just more efficient. Logan would say, well, it's a different way of how we do the task. And Logan proposed when it's not practiced, the task is unpracticed, then we use controlled processing, which is basically the use of some general algorithms to solve problems. We will see an example in a moment. And when we have a task which is practiced, then we have automatic processes. And he said it's basically that we have just memorized the past solutions, which we then automatically can retrieve, and we have immediate access to that. Let's have an example. Let's say you have to multiply or do this mental operations, 5 times 4. How much is that? 20. Okay. How do you know that? Probably just popped into your mind, didn't it? So when you learn mental arithmetics, like children in school, the initial strategy probably would be, okay, I have to sum up the 5 4 times. So 5 plus 5 is 10, plus 5 is 15, plus 5 is 20. That's an example of how you would approach that task in an unpracticed way. And probably we'll do that when I ask you how many is 12 times 13 or something. So It's not that evident for many people still, so they have to go to that general thing. However, if we have done that numerous times, or in school had to just rehearse and learn that, then we just learn in our memory 5 times 4 is 20. When we encounter that problem, we just automatically retrieve it from memory. So what Logan actually suggests is that novices, when they are limited in their performance, it's lack of knowledge and not lack of resources. He just says it's knowledge, not more. So with practice, our knowledge base changes and not the efficiency of some mechanisms. And the more knowledge we have available, the less attentional resources are required. So for instance, if I ask you, you may know these multiplication tables out of your head, but let's say you know them only up to 10. So when I ask you how many times is 11 times 12, from your memory you can retrieve 10 times 12 is 120. So 11 times must be 132. So you can combine those things. You can have one big chunk from memory and then you do only one little thing by such a general problem solver. That is the idea of this statement. Automatic processes, as we already said, are really inflexible. And you probably know that from your everyday life. You know, maybe you take every day the same route to university from where you live. But you say, okay, tomorrow morning I have to pick up something from a friend's house. And you may find yourself at the university and completely forgotten to take a different route because it's so automatic to go there. Schneider and Shiffrin investigated that in their study. And what they did, that they now actually trained a consistent mapping, which is not natural to us. And again, remember their task of the memory set and the display set. And the memory set always consisted of letters between B and L. And the distractor set always consisted of letters between Q and Z. So when you start out the task, you do it in the controlled way. Like in a varied mapping, it's slow, it's deliberate. You have increasing response times with increasing set sizes. However, after 2,000 trials, it became automatic. That means people were able to tell them apart as if that would be numbers and letters, as you've seen before. So they trained a new automatic thing. 2,000 trials may seem quite a lot, but actually in terms of testing sessions, it may just be 2 to 4 one-hour sessions of training. So it's really feasible to do that in an experiment. Now what they did, after some point, after they had established this automaticity, they swapped the sets. Now Q and Z are always in the memory set, and B and L are always in the distractor set. So the automaticity they trained is now not beneficial, but is a problem for them. So they have tried to unautomatize it again. And it took them, so this is a task, it took them more than 1,000 trials to get back to baseline level they started initially. So it takes really a long time to get an automatic behavior out of your system again. And that's probably one foundation for, I think the saying is old habits die hard, or something like that. Something which is automatic really sticks to us. And that, of course, poses some dangers, like tourists coming to the UK and tend always to look into the wrong side when they pass the streets, because in most other countries the cars drive on the other side of the road. And the same for British people going abroad. And that's the reason why you find that always. I've never seen any other country where you so consistently paint where you have to look when you cross the streets. And that's because of this automaticity. Or somewhat related to that, highway hypnosis. If you go for hours, like in the US, on these straight streets, you may suddenly stop at a rest stop and say, what have I done the last hour? I can't remember anything of my driving, because you're in such an automatic autopilot mode that it may actually become dangerous, because you go so much into automaticity that you can't respond properly if something happens, like that an animal jumps in front of your car or something like that. Okay, so to summarize, we have seen that automatic processing is in particular effortless, fast, and outside of our awareness. We can't control it. So, automaticity greatly reduces the demands on cognitive control and attention. So, automaticity is absolutely crucial and important for our everyday life, because suppose you would need deliberate attention for every activity you do. When you walk, you would need attention for every step you make. When you drive, for every little detail. When you write, you would need attention to, okay, how do I form each individual letter? That would be just total overload. So it's a very good strategy of our system to try to automatize as many things as possible, so that we have as many resources left for our really important everyday business. And the most profound disadvantage of that strategy is obviously the inflexibility, that we can't easily change that. So there's always a trade-off between automaticity and having control. And we've seen it's practice which establishes automaticity. Okay, any questions on that? Good. Then we get to the Stroop task. Probably some or most or all of you have seen that task. I don't know how many of you have actually done the Stroop task yourself? Okay, so it's still worth having it here. So okay, let's start with a little bit of background. So this is John Ridley Stroop, and he developed or used this task in his PhD thesis. I think he did not invent it, I'm not quite sure. But because he used it and published the results, he was kind of the name giver for that task. And he used two different conditions. One is name the color of the patch, color patch here. And this is then green, blue, red. Not very difficult. Second condition he had was not to read the word, but name the color of the ink of the word. In this example, green, blue, red. And this can be quite challenging. So, naming the color is slower than naming the patch. That's what he found. And that is what is called Stroop interference. Okay, so why is that the case? And the idea is that reading has become automatic to us. So we can't stop us from reading. And in these cases, the color of the ink and the word are incompatible. Here you have to say green, but you already have read the word red, the color word red. So it comes to interference. And we require controlled processes to override this interference, which has been caused by the automatic reading of the word. Support for this idea comes from studies which show that people who are slow readers have less Stroop interference. Because they haven't read the word so quickly, it doesn't interfere so much. And also, if you do the Stroop task in a second language of people, then the interference is less also. Because the second language is not processed as efficiently, so the representation of the word read in this example is not that strong as in your native language. Okay, let's have a little demonstration. So you all have these color sheets. I think two people always can share one, so maybe there are few missing in front, so we need 2 or 3. Maybe larger groups can spare some. Next time I'll print out more. Behind you, you can get one. And just team up with your neighbors. One person reads aloud the colors, and first, and you may want to time that with a mobile phone if you want to. You don't need to, it's pretty evident otherwise already. And then you do that. You note the times, and then you may swap roles if you want to, or you can do both. We have enough time, it's so quick. Then we just read the other list and time that and see what takes longer. Okay, just do that for like 5 or 10 minutes. Sorry? Yeah, you read in one go all patches, take the time, and then one go for all words. And in the words, of course, you don't read the words, but you name the color of the ink of the words. Okay. 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 As far as I can see, I think most people have done it. Okay, those of you who have taken the time, who observed that naming the colored patches was faster than naming the ink of the word? Oh, actually few. And who was faster? So what did I say? Faster in the patches or slower? Slower. I mean slower with the colored patches and faster with the words. Who was slower with the words? Okay, most people. So I find it quite interesting to to do the task actually yourself, because for most people it's really quite powerful. You really can feel your mind at work when you try to do that task, because for most people the interference is so strong that we really have to focus, we have to concentrate. That's really, you feel how you have to attend to the doing the right task and not being misled by the identity of the word you are reading. So it's really, and you sometimes even can see that in the other person when they get this kind of vacant expression and try to focus and concentrate on the task. So that is controlled processing, what you just experienced in that thing. It's not automatic, you have to override automaticity. Okay, so to summarize and have some concluding things here on the Stroop task, we have seen how strong automaticity can interfere with our intention and task at hand. However, it also shows that we can overcome automaticity. Although it's so strong, we still are able to do the task. I mean, we become slower and we probably make more errors, but it's not that we are lost in automaticity. If we want to, we can override it. So, but we need this deliberate, attentional, controlled processing for that. So, how can we overcome such automatic tendencies? This can be done by something which is called executive functions or executive control processes. And those of you who have read the chapter fully, it can be overcome by something which is called the supervisory attentional system. However, we will deal with that in the last lecture in the term with such higher level executive control functions which can overcome that. Any questions regarding that Stroop task experience? Okay, before we end now, it would be great if I could have these Stroop sheets back to use them next year. Just maybe collect them or get them, leave them at the end of the tables or something like that. Okay, next week then we will deal with short-term memory. Okay, thanks for coming. See you next week.